I'll tell you what. 2 summers ago, I buried 14 fish heads under my tomato plants on a dare from an old neighbor, and what happened over the next 90 days flat out changed how I grow tomatoes for the rest of my life. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. I am not a man who believes in garden voodoo. I'm not the type to chant at my compost pile or hang crystals from my tomato cages. I came up working a small piece of land my whole adult life, and I have always believed that if you can't measure it and repeat it, it's probably nonsense. So when Earl, who's been farming the patch next to mine for going on 40 years, leaned over the fence one Saturday morning in May and told me to start saving fish heads from the market and burying them under my tomato seedlings, I laughed at him. I told him that was the kind of thing my granddad's granddad would have done back when folks still believed pulling a tooth could cure a toothache. And Earl, he just smiled at me, the way an old man smiles when he knows something you don't. And he said, "Son, just try it on 3 plants. Just 3. And then we'll talk in September." Well, I tried it on 3 plants. And by the end of that season, those 3 plants had so completely outgrown, outproduced, and outlasted the other 11 in my row that I sat down in the dirt at the end of August and just stared. I'm going to walk you through exactly what I did, exactly what I learned, the science of why it works, the mistakes I made the second year when I tried to scale it up, and the specific protocol I now use every single spring. And stick with me to the end, because there's one part of this whole process, a small thing I almost skipped the first year, that I think makes the difference between an okay result and a result that genuinely shocks you. And almost nobody talks about it. Let me back up and tell you how this whole thing started, because the context matters. My garden sits on a piece of clay-heavy soil in the middle of a part of the country where summers run long and dry. I've been amending that soil with compost and aged manure for 20-some years, and I've gotten my tomato yield up to what I considered respectable. About 30 to 40 pounds per plant on the indeterminates, a bit less on the determinates. Nothing to brag about, but enough to feed my wife and me, put up jars for winter, and hand off bushels to the church food drive every August. I figured I had it about figured out. Then, Earl wandered over with his fish head idea, and I have to be honest with you, my first reaction was almost insulting. I said, "Earl, that's the oldest trick in the book. The Pilgrims supposedly buried fish under their corn, Squanto and all that. It's folklore." He just nodded and said, "Yeah, and they ate that winter, didn't they?" And then he pointed out that I'd never actually tried it, not once. In 20 years of growing food, I had never tested the single oldest fertilizer trick on the continent. He had me there. So here's what I did that first year. I picked 3 plants in the middle of my main tomato row. 2 were brandywines, 1 was a Cherokee purple. All 3 were about 6 inches tall, ready to go in the ground in late May. I dug each hole about 18 inches deep instead of my usual 8. At the bottom of each hole, I dropped 1 whole fish head from a striped bass a friend of mine had cleaned that morning, plus a handful of the guts and frame trimmings. I covered the fish with about 6 inches of plain garden soil. Then, I added a couple of inches of compost. Then, I set the seedling on top of that compost layer and backfilled around the roots with the rest of the soil. I watered it in well, gave the plant a little stake, and walked away. The other 11 plants in that row got my normal routine. Compost in the hole, a handful of bone meal, transplant, water, mulch. Same varieties, same row, same sun, same water from the same hose. The only variable was that buried fish. For the first 3 weeks, I couldn't see a difference. The fish head plants and the regular plants looked identical. I'll admit, I started to feel a little smug about it. I figured Earl had pulled a fast one on me, and at the end of the year I was going to wave a so-so harvest at him over the fence, and we'd both have a laugh. Then, week 4 hit, and the difference started showing up. The 3 fish head plants put on noticeably darker, glossier leaves. The stems thickened up faster. By week 6, those 3 were a clear half-foot taller than their neighbors, and the foliage on them was so dense you couldn't see the cage through it. Week 8, they set their first trusses of fruit about 10 days ahead of the other plants. By the time July rolled around and I was eating my first real beefsteak of the season, every one of those tomatoes came off the fish head plants. The regular plants were still green and waiting. And then the harvest itself, well, that's where it stopped being interesting and started being almost unbelievable. The 2 brandy wines on fish heads gave me, by my own scale, 68 and 71 pounds of fruit between June and the first frost in October. The Cherokee Purple gave me 63 pounds. My average plant, the 11 that got the standard treatment, came in between 32 and 41 pounds. So I was looking at roughly a doubling of yield from a single, almost free amendment that I would have laughed off the porch 6 months earlier. That winter, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and tried to work out what was actually happening down there in the soil, because I needed to understand the why before I would commit to doing this on every plant. I am not a soil scientist. I am a man who has been reading farming literature for 40 years on rainy afternoons. But I will tell you what I pieced together, and I checked a fair amount of this against the Agricultural Extension Service publications. A fish head is, in nutritional terms, a near-perfect slow-release fertilizer for a fruiting plant. The flesh and brain tissue are loaded with nitrogen in a form that breaks down steadily as soil microbes work on it. The bones release calcium and phosphorus over a period of months, not days. The eyes and offal carry trace amounts of iodine and omega-rich oils that feed soil fungi. And the whole package decomposes at roughly the same rate that a tomato plant grows. By the time the plant is putting on heavy fruit in July and August, the fish is just hitting its peak release window. Your standard granular fertilizer dumps everything in the first 3 weeks and then runs out exactly when the plant needs it most. The fish does the opposite. It saves its best work for the back end of the season. The phosphorus in particular is what I think drives the early flowering and the heavy fruit set. Phosphorus is the nutrient that controls flower production and fruit development, and it's notoriously hard to deliver in a way that plants can actually absorb. Bone meal works, but slowly. Rock phosphate works, but very slowly. Fish bones, sitting 6 inches under your seedling in moist, warm soil, get worked over by every microbe in the dirt, and the phosphorus comes out in a form roots can grab almost immediately. The calcium, meanwhile, is what prevents blossom end rot, that ugly black sunken patch on the bottom of your fruit. Calcium deficiency, exactly the kind of thing fish bones quietly fix without you having to spray a thing. And the nitrogen in the soft tissue does something a granular nitrogen cannot. It feeds microbes first, and then those microbes feed the plant. You're not just shoving nitrogen at a root and hoping. You're building a whole microbial community around the root zone, and that community delivers nutrients on demand the way nothing in a bag from the garden center can match. That is, I think, the real secret. You're not fertilizing the plant. You're feeding the soil that feeds the plant. Now, the second year, I made a mistake that I want you to learn from, because if you don't, you'll do it too, and you'll think the whole method is broken. I went all in. I figured if 3 fish heads doubled 3 plants, then 14 fish heads would double 14 plants. I called my friend at the docks and got a crate of mixed heads, salmon, mackerel, cod frames, a couple of bluefish. I buried one under every plant in the row. And about 10 days later, I started smelling something I really did not want to be smelling. What I learned the hard way is that not all fish are equal, and not all soil temperatures are equal, and not all depths are equal. The salmon heads, which are oily and rich, can attract animals if they're not deep enough. I had a raccoon dig up 2 seedlings in one night chasing the salmon. I had to replant. I also found that in the cooler corner of my garden, where the soil sits in shade until about 10 in the morning, the fish broke down too slowly, went anaerobic, and started producing that rotten egg sulfur smell that means you've created a dead zone instead of a fertile one. 2 of my plants in that corner actually yellowed and stunted because the soil right under their roots had gone sour. So the method works, but the method has rules. And here are the rules I now follow year after year with results I would put up against any commercial fertilizer regimen on the market. First, the depth. You want that fish head a minimum of 12 inches below the surface and ideally 15 to 18. This is not negotiable. Anything shallower and you risk animals digging it up, your roots hitting the rotting mass before it's fully broken down, and the smell making its way to the surface. 12 inches is the magic number where the soil acts like a biological filter. Above that line, the fish is decomposing and unpleasant. Below that line, it's just food for microbes, and you'll never know it's there. I dig my holes deep with a post hole digger now, not a regular spade, because that gets me to 15 inches without breaking my back. Second, the buffer layer. This is the small thing I almost skipped the first year, and it's the one I want you to remember above everything else in this video. Between the fish and the seedling root ball, you must have at least 6 inches of plain soil and another 2 inches of finished compost. Why? Because a fresh fish head sitting in direct contact with a young root system will burn those roots. The decomposition process generates heat and ammonia, and a baby tomato root will take damage if it's pressed right up against that. The buffer layer gives the fish time to begin breaking down before the roots ever reach it. By the time those roots have grown down into the rich zone where the fish is decomposing, 2 months have passed, the worst of the heat is over, the ammonia has converted to plant-usable nitrogen, and the roots find a gold mine waiting for them. Skip the buffer, and you'll burn your seedling. Use the buffer, and you'll feed it for 100 days. Third, the type of fish. Lean fish like cod, haddock, sea bass, or freshwater species like bass and perch are perfect. The flesh is moderate in oil content, the bones are fine and break down at a sensible pace, and animals are less attracted to them once they're buried deep. Avoid pure salmon and mackerel as your primary input. They're too oily, they go rancid fast, and they're a beacon for raccoons and possums. If salmon is what you've got, use it sparingly and bury it deeper, 18 inches minimum, and never in shaded soil. The best mix I've ever used is a head from a white-fleshed fish plus a small handful of guts and trimmings. That gives you the bone, the brain, the soft tissue, and the bacterial richness all in one shot. Fourth, the soil temperature when you plant. Don't bury fish in cold soil. If your soil hasn't hit at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the microbes that break down the fish are still mostly dormant, and you'll get slow rot instead of fast decomposition. That's how the sulfur smell starts and how the dead zones form. Wait until your soil is properly warmed up, which in most of the country means late May or early June, depending on your zone. I check soil temperature with a cheap kitchen thermometer, push 6 inches into the ground for about 5 minutes. If the reading comes back over 62, I'm good. Below that, I wait another week. Fifth, the fish to plant ratio. 1 head per plant is plenty for any standard tomato, pepper, or eggplant. Don't get greedy and load up 2 or 3. More is not better. You'll just make the soil too rich in nitrogen, and you'll get massive leafy plants with very little fruit. I learned that one too in year 3 when I doubled up under a couple of San Marzanos and ended up with bushes the size of a small car and exactly 4 tomatoes between them. The plant pushes leaves when it has too much nitrogen and saves fruiting for when nutrients tighten up. 1 head, 1 plant. That's the rule. Sixth, mulch on top. After you've planted, after you've watered in, lay down 2 to 3 inches of straw or shredded leaves over the whole bed. This does 2 things. It traps moisture, which keeps the microbial activity steady down where the fish is working, and it masks any faint scent that might escape through the soil. I've never had an animal dig up a properly buried, properly mulched plant. Not once in 5 seasons. Now let me tell you what to actually expect once you do this, because I think managing your expectations is part of the deal. For the first 3 weeks, your fish-fed plant will look exactly like every other plant in your row. You will not be able to tell the difference. Don't panic. Don't dig it up to check. The fish is doing its work 2 feet below where you can see, and the plant root system is busy building itself out before it puts on top growth. Around week 4, you'll notice a slight darkening of the foliage. Around week 6, the size difference becomes obvious. By week 8, you'll see the first flower trusses appear earlier than on your control plants. And from week 10 onward, the fish-fed plant just keeps producing week after week well into autumn, while your other plants start to slow down and pack it in. The fruit itself, I will tell you, tastes different. I don't have a scientific way to prove this to you, but my wife noticed it before I even told her what I was doing. She said the brandy wines that year had a deeper flavor, sweeter, and somehow more complex. I think the trace minerals from the fish, the iodine, the magnesium, the small amounts of potassium and zinc, all end up in the fruit. You're not just feeding the plant the big 3, you're feeding it a complete oceanic mineral profile that corn-fed bagged fertilizer simply cannot replicate. Once you've eaten a fish-fed tomato, the regular ones taste a little hollow. Let me address a few questions I get all the time when I talk about this method, because I think they're worth covering directly. The first one is, won't it stink up my whole garden? The honest answer is no, not if you do it right. Buried 12 to 18 inches deep in warm soil with a buffer of compost and soil and a layer of mulch on top, you will never smell a thing. I've had visitors walk right past my tomato row in July and ask why my plants look so good, with no idea there's a base head decomposing 2 feet below their boots. The smell happens when the fish is too shallow, the soil is too cold, or the mulch is missing. Get those 3 things right and you're invisible to the nose. The second question is, won't this attract animals? Same answer. Depth and mulch handle this. The reason raccoons dig up fish is they can smell it. They can't smell 15 inches of warm soil with 3 inches of straw on top. They just can't. The one exception is the first 24 hours after you plant, when the disturbed earth is still releasing scent. I've taken to laying a piece of cardboard or a brick over the freshly mulched spot for the first day, and that handles the brief vulnerable window. Third question, can you do this with crops other than tomatoes? Absolutely. I now use it for peppers, eggplant, courgettes, cucumbers, and squash. Anything that fruits heavily benefits from the slow-release phosphorus and calcium profile that fish provides. I would not use it on root vegetables because you don't want roots running into a decomposing mass and developing forks or off flavors. And I'd skip it on leafy greens because they don't need that kind of long-season feeding. They're done in 6 weeks. But for any plant that flowers and fruits over a long season, fish is honestly transformational. Fourth question, what about smaller fish, like sardines or anchovies from a tin? I get asked this all the time, especially by folks gardening on small balconies or in containers. The answer is yes, with caveats. A few whole sardines per container plant works fine. Pack them deep, buffer well, and don't go crazy with the quantity. In a 5-gallon pot, 2 or 3 small whole fish are plenty. In a bigger bed, a tin of oily sardines per plant won't hurt. But you might prefer the fresh head from your fishmonger because it's more bone-dense and breaks down at a slower, more useful rate. Now let me give you the simple step-by-step protocol I follow every spring, so you can do this yourself this year. The week before you plan to transplant, talk to your local fishmonger or fish counter at the supermarket. Most of them will give you fish heads and frames for free or for almost nothing because they're paying to dispose of them otherwise. Ask for white-fleshed fish if possible, and ask them to set aside what you need on the morning of your planting day. Get them home, keep them cold, and use them within 24 hours. Don't try to freeze and store, just plan around the freshness. On planting day, dig your holes deep. 18 inches is what I aim for. At the bottom of each hole, place 1 fish head, plus a small handful of frame trimmings or guts if you have them. Cover with 6 inches of plain garden soil. Tamp it down lightly. Add 2 to 3 inches of finished compost. Set your seedling on top of the compost layer. Backfill around the roots with native soil mixed with a bit more compost. Water in deeply until the surrounding soil is wet down at least 12 inches. Lay down 2 or 3 inches of straw or shredded leaf mulch over the whole bed, keeping it about 2 inches away from the stem of the seedling. And then you walk away. That is the entire protocol. You do not need to add a single thing for the rest of the season. No granular fertilizers, no compost teas, no foliar sprays, no fancy bottled solutions. Just deep watering on a sensible schedule and a careful eye on your trellising. The fish does the rest. The one thing I do add now, because I learned it in year 4, is a single calcium top-up around the time the first fruit sets, just as insurance. I crush about 10 eggshells, soak them overnight in a liter of water, and pour the strained water around the base of each plant. It takes 10 minutes, and it pretty much guarantees no blossom end rot, even in a year where the watering gets uneven during a hot, dry spell. That's the small thing I almost skipped that I mentioned at the start, and it's the small thing I would never skip again. Let me tell you about my 3rd year, because I think it's the proof of the method. By year 3, I had refined my protocol to almost exactly what I just described. I planted 12 indeterminate tomato plants, all of them with buried fish heads, all of them with the buffer layer, all of them with proper mulch. That season, in a year that was hotter and drier than usual, with a stretch of 3 weeks in July where we didn't get a drop of rain, those 12 plants gave me 843 pounds of tomatoes by the first frost. I weighed every single basket. My wife thought I'd lost my mind, but I wanted the data. 843 pounds from 12 plants in a drought year. That's an average of 70 pounds per plant, in conditions that should have cut my yield in half. The buried fish, slowly releasing nutrients and feeding a deep microbial community, kept those plants going through a stretch of weather that punished every other garden in my neighborhood. My neighbor, who waters his tomatoes daily and uses the same brand of granular fertilizer everyone in the town buys, got about 30 pounds per plant that year. Same town, same weather, same soil type. Different protocol underground. I'm not going to sit here and tell you fish heads are a miracle. They aren't. You still need decent soil, full sun, consistent watering, and good varieties. What fish heads do is they remove the bottleneck. Most home gardens are limited not by sun or by water, but by available nutrients in the form the plant can actually use. A buried fish solves that problem for an entire season, and it does it for free, with 0 packaging, 0 shipping, and almost 0 labor beyond digging a slightly deeper hole on planting day. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for staying with me because I know that was a long conversation. But this is the kind of thing I think more people deserve to know, and I think the gardening world has gotten a little bit too comfortable selling people bottles and bags when the real answers have been sitting in the discard pile at the fish counter for centuries. Try this on 3 plants. That's all I'm asking, 3 plants this season. Pick the same variety, same row, same sun, same water. Bury a fish head under 3 of them, and don't bury one under 3 others. Then, write down what you see in September. I'm willing to bet you're going to come back and tell me you doubled your yield, just like I did, just like Earl told me 20 years before I finally listened. If you found this useful, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got more old-fashioned, low-cost, high-yield techniques like this coming through every couple of weeks. And drop me a comment below telling me what you grow most of in your garden, and whether you've ever tried a buried fish method before, or whether this is the first you're hearing of it. I read every single comment, and your stories are honestly part of what keeps this channel going. Thanks for spending the time with me today, and I'll see you out by the fence.